In 1885, a 22-year-old Dutch woman named Johanna Bonger met Theo van Gogh, the younger brother of the Vincent van Gogh, who was then making a name for himself as an art dealer in Paris. Theo, who selflessly managed Vincent's erratic path through life, but he had his share of impetuosity. He asked her to marry him after only 2 meetings. Jo, as she called herself, was raised in a sober, middle-class family. She had set herself up in a safely unexciting career as an English teacher in Amsterdam. She was already dating somebody. She said no. But Theo persisted. He was attractive in a soulful kind of way, a thinner, paler version of his brother. Beyond that, she had a taste for culture, a desire to be in the company of artists and intellectuals, which he could certainly provide. Eventually he won her over. In 1888, she agreed to marry him. After that, a new life opened up for her. It was Paris in the Belle Epoque: art, theatre, intellectuals, the streets of their Pigalle neighborhood raucous with cafes and brothels. Theo was not just any art dealer. He was at the forefront, specializing in the breed of young artists who were defying the stony realism imposed by the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Most dealers wouldn't touch the Impressionists, but they were Theo van Gogh's clients. And here they came, Gauguin and Pissarro and Toulouse-Lautrec, the young men of the avant-garde. Jo realized that she was in the midst of a movement, that she was witnessing a change in the direction of things. She was powerfully in love with Theo, with Paris, with life. Theo talked incessantly of their future, and also of things like pigment and color and light, encouraging her to develop a new way of seeing. But one subject dominated. From their first meeting, he regaled Jo with accounts of his brother's tortured genius. Their apartment was crammed with Vincent's paintings, and new crates arrived all the time. Vincent, who spent much of his brief career in France, Belgium, England, the Netherlands, was churning out canvases at a fanatical pace, sometimes 1 painting a day. He shipped them to Theo in hopes he would find a market for them. Theo had little success attracting buyers, but Vincent's works became the source material for Jo's education in modern art. As much as he looked up to his brother, Theo also fretted constantly about him. Vincent's mental state had already deteriorated by the time Jo came on the scene. Just before Christmas in 1888, while Theo and Jo were announcing their engagement, Vincent was in Arles cutting off his ear following a series of rows with his housemate Paul Gauguin. In the spring of 1890, Vincent was coming to Paris. Jo expected an enfeebled mental patient. Instead, she was confronted by the physical embodiment of the spirit that animated the canvases that covered their walls. Theo had arranged for Vincent to stay in the village of Auvers-sur-Oise to the north of Paris, in the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, whose homeopathic approach he hoped would help his brother's condition. Weeks later came news that Vincent had shot himself. Some biographers dispute the notion that his wound was self-inflicted. Theo arrived in the village in time to watch his brother die. He was devastated. Less than 3 months after Vincent's death, Theo suffered a complete physical collapse, the latter stages of syphilis he had contracted from earlier visits to brothels. He began hallucinating. His agony was tremendous and ghoulish. He died in January 1891. 21 months after her marriage, Jo was alone, stunned at the fecund dose of life she had just experienced, and at what was left to her from that life, approximately 400 paintings and several hundred drawings by her brother-in-law. The brothers dying so young, Vincent at 37 and Theo at 33, and without the artist having achieved renown. Theo had managed to sell only a few of his paintings. Jo suddenly had to provide for herself and her son Vincent, who was still a young baby. And what was she to do with the hundreds of Vincent's paintings that Theo had left to her? When a friend from the genteel Dutch village of Bussum suggested she come there and open a boarding house, it seemed soothing. She would be back in her home country yet at a comfortable distance from her family. Bussum, for all its leafy sedateness, had a lively cultural scene. And having income from guests would be important. She would be able to provide for herself and her child. Before leaving Paris, she corresponded with the artist Émile Bernard, one of the few painters with whom Vincent had had a relationship that was both close and free of discord, to see if he might be able to arrange an exhibition in Paris of her late brother-in-law's paintings. Bernard urged her to leave Vincent's canvases in Paris, reasoning that the French capital was a better base from which to sell them. Vincent had had paintings exhibited in a few group shows just before his death. Perhaps, over time, Bernard would be able to sell his work. But Jo's instincts told her to keep the paintings with her. She declined his offer. This was remarkable in itself, because time and again her diary entries show her to be riddled with insecurities and uncertainty about how to proceed in life. Over the next weeks, dressed in mourning, she settled into her new home. She unpacked linens and silverware, met her neighbors and prepared the house for guests, all the while caring for little Vincent. She seems to have spent the greatest amount of her settling in time, months, in fact, deciding precisely where to hang her brother-in-law's paintings. Eventually, virtually every inch of wall space was covered with them. One of her guests later remarked that the whole house was filled with Vincent's. In addition to Vincent's paintings, she had inherited the enormous trove of letters that the brothers had exchanged. In Bussum, in the evenings, with her guests taken care of and the baby asleep, she pored over them. Nearly all, it turned out, were from Vincent. Her husband had carefully kept Vincent's letters. Details of the artist's daily life and tribulations, his insomnia, his poverty, his self-doubt, were mixed with accounts of paintings he was working on, techniques he experimented with, what he was reading, descriptions of paintings by other artists he drew inspiration from. She did a lot of other reading as well, undertaking what amounted to a self-guided course in art criticism. She read the Belgian journal La Moderne, which advocated the idea that art should serve progressive political causes, and took notes. She began to circulate in society. Some of the people she knew in the area were part of a community of artists, poets and intellectuals who had founded an arts journal called The New Guide. As the industrialization of the late 1880s and early 1890s spawned an anarchist movement and rising nationalisms, they were processing the ferment in Western society and sorting through how the arts should respond. By the end of her first year on her own, living with Vincent's paintings and his words, reading deeply, immersing herself from time to time in these gatherings, Jo had experienced a kind of epiphany. Van Gogh's letters were part and parcel of the art. They were keys to the paintings. The letters brought the art and the tragic, intensely lived life together into a single package. Vincent's letters and paintings seemed to reinforce Jo's own long-standing convictions about social justice. Just before agreeing to marry Theo, she visited Belgium, and the minister whose family she was staying with took her to see the living conditions of workers at a nearby coal mine. The experience shocked her, and helped fuel what became a lifelong dedication to causes ranging from workers' rights to female suffrage. She counted herself as one of the ordinary people Vincent had written of, and she knew that he had considered himself one as well. After consuming her tortured brother-in-law's words alone in her guesthouse one night during a storm in 1891, with the wind howling outside, she wrote in a letter, "I felt so desolate, that for the first time I understood what he must have felt, in those times when everyone turned away from him." She was now ready to act as agent for Vincent van Gogh. One of her first moves was to approach an art critic named Jan Pieter With, who in addition to being the husband of a friend was at the forefront of the New Guide circle. With was outspoken in his rejection of academic art and in promoting individual expression. At first, though, With dismissed Vincent's work outright and belittled Jo's efforts. He himself later admitted that he was initially repelled by the raw violence of some Van Goghs, and found these paintings nearly vulgar. Jo found Vith's reaction disappointingly conventional. He must also have said something disparaging about a woman seeking to enter the art world, because she complained to her diary after an encounter with him, "We women are for the most part what men want us to be." But she realized his importance as a critic and believed that his openness to new ideas meant that she could persuade him to appreciate the paintings, telling her diary, "I won't rest until he likes them." She pressed an envelope full of Vincent's letters on Vith, encouraging him to use them, as she had, as a means to illuminate the paintings. She didn't try to come across like an art critic, but instead poured her heart out to the man, trying to guide him toward the shift in thinking that she felt was needed to perceive a new mode of artistic expression. Her timing was good. The Dutch historian Johan Huizinga later characterized the change of spirit that began to be felt in art and literature around 1890 as a swirl of ideas that coalesced around two poles, that of socialism and that of mysticism. Jo saw that Vincent's art straddled both. Jan Pieter With was among those trying to process a shift from Impressionism to something new, an art that applied individualism to social and even spiritual questions. He listened to Jo and came around. He wrote one of the first appreciations of the artist, saying that he now saw the astonishing clairvoyance of great humility and characterized Vincent as an artist who seeks the raw root of things. Something similar happened when Jo approached an influential artist named Richard Roland Holst to ask him to help promote Vincent. She must have pestered him relentlessly, because Roland Holst wrote to a friend, "Mrs. Van Gogh is a charming woman, but it irritates me when someone fanatically raves about something they don't understand." But he came around, too, and assisted Jo with one of the first solo exhibitions of Vincent's art, in Amsterdam in December 1892. When Jo asked Roland Holst to make a cover illustration for the catalogue of Vincent's first exhibit in Amsterdam, he crafted a lithograph of a wilting sunflower against a black background, with the word Vincent beneath and a halo above the sunflower, an aesthetic canonization. Jo worked doggedly to build on her early successes with critics. She eventually remarried to another Dutch painter, Johan Cohen Gostjork. She became a member of the Dutch Social Democratic Workers' Party and a co-founder of an organization devoted to labor and women's rights. In 1895, when Jo was 33, the Parisian dealer Ambroise Vollard included 20 Van Goghs in a show. Vincent's intensely personal and emotion-filled approach had been ahead of its time, but time was catching up. In Antwerp, a group of young artists who saw him as a trailblazer asked to borrow several Van Goghs to exhibit alongside their own work. Jo learned the tricks of the trade, for example, to hold on to the best works but to include them as on loan alongside paintings that were for sale in a given show. She knew that if you put a few top works on the wall, people will be stimulated to buy the works next to them. The success she had had in promoting her brother-in-law's art boosted her self-confidence. As more and more people in the field came to agree with her assessment of Vincent, she shed her youthful hesitancy. Rather than hand over the task of organizing the show, she insisted on doing everything herself. She rented the galleries, printed the posters, assembled names of important people to invite, even bought bow ties for the staff. Her son, Vincent, now 15, wrote out the invitations. The result was, and remains, the largest ever Van Gogh exhibition, with 484 works on display. In the meantime, Jo had started another major project, publishing Vincent's letters to his brother Theo. Selecting and editing the letters not only brought her closer to the artist, but also to her deceased husband, as the brothers were close and wrote to each other frequently. Categorized and edited the letters, and wrote a biographical introduction about Vincent van Gogh. For years, this text would remain the source for other texts about the artist. Thanks to the publication of the letters in 1914, appreciation rose not only for Vincent as an artist, but also for him as a human being. Jo had studied English and worked steadily on an English translation of the letters. When she died in 1925, Jo had translated about 2/3 of the letters. The English edition of the letters was published 4 years later. Between 1891 and 1925, Jo sold nearly 200 of Vincent's artworks. But there was one work that she and her son had difficulty parting with. They still owned 2 of the 5 sunflowers paintings, and loved the works dearly. Jo eventually sold one of the paintings to the National Gallery in London in 1924. Thanks to sacrifices such as this, Jo was able to fulfill her wish, and that of her late husband Theo. When she died in 1925, Vincent's work was world-famous and exhibited at museums all around the world. At the same time, Jo always knew exactly which works she did not want to sell. For example, because certain works were of emotional value to the family or because they were favorites of hers, such as The Harvest. This core collection was to stay in the family. After Jo passed away, her son Vincent transferred the artworks that were still in the family to a foundation. He was also one of the founders of the Van Gogh Museum. It was his greatest wish that the collection be permanently accessible to all. This way Vincent continued working to realize his parents' dream. To this day we can admire the core collection of the Van Gogh family in the Van Gogh Museum. So what do you think about Johanna Bonger? Thanks for watching. If you like this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more. I'll see you in the next one.